Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be making more progress on the turbo kit for the 8.1 swapped Silverado, and I hope to hear it fire up for the first time today with a turbo in place. My name's LT, and I've got a small shop here in central Utah, and on this channel I document some of the builds that I do, and I show you guys every step along the way. So if you like building high performance and custom trucks, and if you haven't already, you definitely need to subscribe to this channel. I've got a goal to reach 30,000 subs by the end of the year, and I know we can make that happen with your help. So if you haven't already, help me out, hit that subscribe button. Let's get started. The one comment that I get more than anything about the Turbo 8.1 is, you should have done a remote mount turbo. Yes, I will agree that a remote mount setup, it would have been a whole lot easier to install, but sometimes, in my opinion, the easiest route is not always the best route. Now, I know there are a lot of guys that do remote mount setups and they get them to run, well, really well, but I've just never been a fan for a couple of reasons. You know, you've got to run a remote oiling system, or you've got to run some sort of a scavenge oil return pump. And then there's a lot more distance between the engine and the turbo in terms of the exhaust routing as well as the charge side of things. They're also a little bit more susceptible to road damage if, you know, something were to happen. And so for all those reasons, and maybe just a little bit of stubbornness, I've always preferred my turbos mounted up high in the engine bay. Now, last time I showed you what it takes to build the manifold and get the turbo mounted, but it's actually in a different spot. I've made a pretty big change since you saw it in the last upload. Now, before I had about a 60-degree bend on this last elbow feeding the turbo, but where I want to run my wastegate, it just would have been too close to the cylinder head, the ignition coil, the plug wires, and I would have been melting a lot of stuff. So I cut off that 60-degree bend and I added this one, which is about 80 to 85 degrees, and I also straightened out the turbo just a little bit. Before, it was kind of pointed towards the engine, and I straightened it out, like I said, just a little bit. It'll make the downpipe routing a little bit easier, but the stock inner fender is still gonna fit. I've got plenty of room for my oil feed and my oil drain line. Now I've got a ton of room to run the wastegate and have the dump tube fitting back, which will probably recirculate into the downpipe somewhere in that area. And so now I'm really happy with how it's turned out. Yeah, it was a whole lot more work, but that's all right. I got plenty of seat time in the welder, so practice makes perfect, I guess. So today, let me show you some of the parts that we're going to be putting on to make some more headway. I think the first thing that I'm going to tackle today is the exhaust crossover, and it's going to be made from regular 2.5-inch stainless steel. So I got some exhaust tube and a couple of flanges. On the driver's side is a factory-style 3-bolt flange that uses one of these metal sealing rings, and on the opposite end, just a regular V-band. Now, in my opinion, probably the most important part of a properly designed turbo setup is the wastegate, because it's what controls your boost. I've got a nearly 500 cubic inch engine, a pretty big turbo, and I want to run it at a pretty low boost level at first just to make that 8.1 live until I can rebuild it. Now, to make a big engine and a big turbo run at low boost, you've got to bypass a lot of exhaust energy around the turbocharger, and to do that, you need a pretty big gate. This is a VS Racing 60mm wastegate, and as you can see, it takes up quite a bit of real estate. It uses on the bottom a 2.5-inch inlet, and it's got a 2.25-inch outlet. So, like I said, that thing is huge, and that's the main reason why I had to redo the exhaust manifold, but that's all right, I've got plenty of space now. Lastly, the S400 uses a 5-inch Marmon style flange out the back. So I picked up this billet adapter that goes from the 5-inch Marmon to 4-inch tube, so I can run just your regular 4-inch exhaust tube. So let's get started. So if you've followed me for any amount of time, you might have picked up on the fact that I really enjoy building exhaust systems. I don't know what it is, there's just something about it that is satisfying to do. Now, there's a couple things that I always have to keep in mind when building a custom exhaust. And number one, don't forget that some stuff is sensitive to heat. In this application, I'm trying to keep the pipes an adequate distance away from, the starter, the wires going to the starter, the transmission cooler lines, and keep it a little bit away from the oil pan and the bell housing on the transmission. Also, you got to remember that the engine is going to move around when you're on and off the throttle, so keep it away from things that don't move, like the frame rails. Right now I've got the crossover 100% mocked up and it's all tacked in place except for one connection in the middle. There's two reasons. I'm not sure yet if I can get the crossover out in one piece because it is a fairly long pipe going from manifold to manifold. And number two, it's just going to be a little bit easier to weld in separate sections. So here's the plan. I'm going to take the crossover out and I'm going to fully weld both halves together. Back purge it, weld it, and get them all done and put both halves back on the truck. Then I'll come in and I'll tack weld it underneath the truck with it bolted up to both ends of the manifold so I know it's going to line up exactly where it needs to be. And then I'll see if I can take it out in one piece. If I can, no problem. I'll just break those 3 tack welds and I'll put in a V-band because I do have an extra one. But if I can't take it out in one piece, which I'm hoping I can, perfect. I'll just take the crossover out, finish weld the last joint, and we'll be on our way. Now, I really like to make exhaust systems in as big of sections as I can with all the joints fully welded. I like to minimize how many clamps or connections that I have. And I think that's really important in a situation like this where we're feeding exhaust pressure into a turbocharger because, well, any more clamps that you have, it's just another opportunity for a leak. So the fewer connections you can have, the fewer leaks will be possible and you'll just have a better performing system, in my opinion. So once I get everything welded up, then we can work on the wastegate. Purging is basically where you shield the backside of a weld with some sort of a shielding gas. And my setup is pretty simple. I've just got an extra bottle, a little bit of hose on the end of the regulator, and some tin foil. Now, back purging is especially important when you're working with stainless steel because of what they call carbide precipitation, which is basically where the backside of the weld kind of turns to slag or some nasty looking stuff whenever it's not shielded. Now, whenever I'm building a full exhaust, I usually don't bother back purging simply because of how much gas it does take. It can get expensive, but whenever I'm working with something that goes in between the engine and the turbo, I do make sure to back purge it just because I have heard of those little pieces of slag potentially breaking off, entering the turbo and causing damage. So it is a good precaution that you want to take. I'm also using 2 different types of filler for this particular project. I'm using 309 for the O2 bung and for the 3-bolt flange on the driver's side because those are both mild steel, and 309 is a great filler for joining mild to stainless. And for the joints between the 2 stainless pieces of pipe, I'm using 308 filler because it does give a little bit better finished product, and 308 is intended for only stainless. The crossover pipe is 100% complete, and I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with how it looks. I think it turned out okay. I'm really happy with the fact that I was able to make it in one long solid piece without that extra V-band in the middle, just because, like I said, it minimizes the chances for leaking. Now, I could throw this back up underneath the truck now, but I do want to take care of the wastegate first because that's really the last thing that's stopping me from bolting the manifold on the truck for good, because right now we're still mocked up. I'm going to be making the Wastegate Branch out of the same 2.5-inch Schedule 40 pipe that I've been working with for the rest of the manifold. It is pretty big, but it will feed plenty of exhaust into that 60mm wastegate and it'll be nice and sturdy. So let's continue on. I'll start off the wastegate tube with a 38-degree cut on the shop saw, but after that it's just a matter of getting it fit up by hand, so it is going to take a little bit of work with the angle grinder. But with a little bit of persistence, I've got it to fit perfectly. I'm going to tack weld the branch tube onto the manifold and use it as a guide for the hole saw to punch a hole into the main section of the manifold. The hole saw won't go all the way through the first time around, so I'll just cut the tack welds on the tube, cut the center of the hole in half, and then finish up the hole by hand. I've got to get all the cutting oil off of the metal, and then I can weld the V-band onto the short tube, and then weld the branch onto the main section of the manifold. I wish I would have kept track of how many hours I've got into this manifold project because it is quite a bit. You know, it does take a lot of time to do it, but I'm glad I stuck it out and I'm glad I made it the way that I wanted to from the very beginning instead of going with a remote mount. So check her out. There it is, the completed 8-1 swap turbo manifold. We've got two 2.5-inch branches feeding a single 3-inch elbow. And then the wastegate placement, I think they call that like wastegate priority, because basically you've got a straight shot from where the two pipes merge into the gate, and that's going to be for optimum boost control. Now I also added on this little mount tab right here because this whole manifold is pretty heavy, and that's not even counting the turbo off to the side. That probably weighs like another 50 pounds or so. And that's a lot of weight to be hanging off of a manifold, so I'm just going to have some sort of a turnbuckle or a strap that goes between the mount tab and the front of the cylinder head, just to give it that extra little bit of support. So right now this thing's ready to go onto the truck, which I hope will be for the very last time. Of course, there's always that risk of having a little bit too much boost and grenading the motor, and then I'll have to take it all back apart again, but that's a problem for another day. Let's continue on. So just two things left before I can fire up the 8.1 with the turbo in place, and that's oil. I gotta get oil into and out of the turbo. Feeding the oil, that's no problem. There's an unused port on my engine that was for the oil cooler feed. I'm just gonna tap into that and run a hose up to the top of the turbo and it'll get lubricated. But I also have to get the oil back into the oil pan, so I pulled it off the truck. I didn't show you the steps because honestly it's not that interesting and kind of hard to film under the truck, but all you gotta do is drop the rack and pinion. On a 4-wheel drive truck, obviously it's a lot harder, but 2-wheel drive, it came right out. I'm gonna be running a -10 return right here on the passenger side of the pan. So I cleaned it up pretty good. I'm still gonna do a little bit more cleaning. And then I'm gonna be using one of these right here, just a -10 aluminum weld-in bung. The nut and bolt, that's just gonna kind of help hold it into the oil pan while I'm welding it. But I really do prefer to use an AN style weld fitting wherever possible for an oil return. Number one, because it's the right way to do it, honestly. And number two, I don't like the risk of drilling into the pan with it still on the truck and tapping, pipe thread in there. You can do it and it'll work, but you just have to be super, super careful. Put a bunch of grease on the tap to make sure you don't get any shavings down in the bottom of the pan. I really don't like to do it. So like I said, I just prefer to pull the pan. It was super easy on this truck being a 2-wheel drive. So I'll get it welded in, get the hoses ran, and we'll get this 8.1 fired up. I'll be the first to admit I don't get to weld aluminum nearly as much as I should, but this one is just not turning out as pretty as I would have hoped. But that's all right, the bung is in place and I know it's not going to leak. I'll get the oil lines ran to and from the turbo, and we'll get this 8.1 fired up. It feels so cool to finally hear the 8.1 fire up with the S480 sitting off to the side. I've been dreaming about this day for a long time, and it's just so cool to just see it materialize. You have a plan in your head and you just work hard at it and it'll eventually happen. Now, we made a lot of progress this week and probably a little bit more work than I should have put into a single upload, but that's all right. Progress is progress. but we're not out of the woods yet. We still have a lot of work to do on this turbo kit. Next time I'll probably handle the cold side. I've got to get the intercooler mounted, got to get the cold side piping built, and then there's the down pipe. I'm going to fit a 4-inch down pipe, and I left enough room for it, and then recirculate the wastegate back into the down pipe. And that's just all more fab work. But then we're still not done, because we got to throw in some bigger injectors, throw a bigger fuel pump in the tank, and just the list goes on. And the part spend, well, it keeps going up and up and up. But I want to say thank you guys for watching. I do appreciate each and every one of you subscribers. And if you haven't already, help me out. We want to get to 30,000 subs by the end of 2020. And I know we can make it happen with your help. So hit that little bell button, hit the subscribe, or whatever you're supposed to do. You guys know how it works. So I'll catch you next time on the 8.1 with some more fab work. We'll get the intercooler in. Thanks for watching. I'm LT.